In this next unit in chemistry, we're going to be talking about why chemical reactions happen in the first place. And in order to understand why reactions happen, we have to start by talking about energy. Now, just like matter in the atoms that we've been talking about, matter cannot be created or destroyed, and energy also cannot be created or destroyed. But we do find energy existing in many different forms, and energy can transform from one type to another. You're familiar probably with many of these different forms of energy. You've probably studied them in previous years. We talked a little bit about thermal energy just a few days ago, but some of the other forms of energy are electrical energy, of course, nuclear energy inside the nucleus of an atom, chemical energy in chemical bonds, mechanical energy for moving objects, and then electromagnetic energy as we see in all types of light waves. Furthermore, energy can be divided into two different types. Is it potential energy, or energy that is in a stored format, or is it kinetic energy, which is energy causing some kind of motion? So in the little diagram here, we have potential energy of a person waiting at the top of the water slide. This is gravitational potential energy because they are above the surface of the earth that they have that energy potentially to fall back down again. And as they go down the slide, we are changing that potential energy into kinetic energy, or the energy of the motion. In food, we have potential energy due to the chemical bonds between the atoms in certain molecules, like we have in the sugar molecule. And when those bonds are broken through cellular respiration, if you remember from biology class, you're going to release energy, and it'll be packaged into ATP, but that energy then can be used for work in the cells, the motion that has to happen in the cells, and then you have carbon dioxide and water being released. Again, in food, the sugar molecules, the food molecules are potential energy, and then when that energy is released, things can move in the cell, and that becomes the kinetic energy. So as I just said, our chemical potential energy is found inside the molecules, the bonds that hold the atoms together, whether they are ionic bonds or covalent bonds. Those bonds contain potential energy. And as the bonds break and reform in chemical reactions, then energy is absorbed and released. And it is the net energy change, is more energy being absorbed or is more energy being released, that is really important when it comes to chemical reactions. So I've created a picture of a chemical reaction for us to think about this particular concept of energy moving in and out of bonds. This, you can see, is a single replacement reaction where we have a single element and a compound, and then we have a compound with a single element left over. And if you trace the colors, you can see that the orange atom starts out not being bonded to anything, and it ends up being bonded to the green when we get done on the other side of this reaction. So this is the simplified form, but what actually is happening as these chemicals react together? Well, the first thing that has to happen is that the bond has to break between our green and blue molecules. And in order for that to happen, we have to put energy into that molecule. We have to pull it apart, just like we were pulling apart two Legos, or anything that we're taking apart is going to take energy in. So energy needs to go in to break the bonds. And it'll take the green and the blue molecules and make them separate. So you can see they now have been separated, and in the middle we have all this energy that used to be part of the bond, used to be what was holding the molecules together, and at the moment it's free energy. It's not doing anything else. This is not something that takes a whole lot of time, and so this free energy doesn't hang around a long time. The next step, and I have to make this in two lines, so we'll just kind of go around the corner here because I just don't have enough room. So then we have our freely floating green and blue, and that orange is still there. And in this situation, if this chemical reaction happening, we're going to have a new bond form between the green and the orange. And so that bond is going to take energy. So some of this free energy is going to go into the bond that is holding these two atoms together. But it didn't take quite as much to make a bond between the green and the orange as there was present in the bond between the green and the blue. So we have a little bit of energy left over along with this leftover blue atom. And this extra energy then can be used to do something else. In the very least, we're going to feel it as heat. So as this energy inside a substance changes, as bonds are broken or new bonds are made in a chemical reaction, we are affecting what is known as the enthalpy. So enthalpy, and it's given the letter H because in most cases we are measuring enthalpy by measuring a change in heat, and the way that we measure the change in heat energy is by taking the temperature, if you remember our previous lesson. And so enthalpy is the internal energy of a substance. How much energy is present inside something held in those chemical bonds. But we can't really look at those chemical bonds by themselves and determine the energy. We can only measure the energy when it changes, because then we're going to see heat moving and we'll be able to take the temperature. Now, enthalpy can change in one of two directions. It can be released or it can be absorbed. When it's released, when we write out the equations for calculating it, it will be given a negative value. And this negative value is telling us that energy is being released. These are known as exothermic reactions. And the products, what comes out of the reaction, actually has less energy or needs less energy than the reactants going into the reaction, and so we have energy being released. The enthalpy number will be positive when energy is absorbed. And these are known as endothermic reactions. And because energy has to be absorbed, then the products of the reaction actually need more energy to hold them together than the reactants do. And so that's why energy needs to go in. We use the symbol delta H to talk about a change in enthalpy. Remember, H is enthalpy. Delta just means change in, so a negative delta H is an exothermic reaction, and a positive delta H is an endothermic reaction. So heat is always going to flow from a high heat area to a low heat area. In the case of an exothermic reaction, then, the higher heat is found to wherever the reaction is happening. So in this case, we have a reaction happening inside this beaker in our solution, and the heat will be released from that reaction, and it'll go out into the surroundings. And so you'll be able to put your hand on the beaker. You will feel it is warm. You'll be able to tell that the temperature has changed as the heat moves from the reaction out into the environment, because that heat is representing the extra energy that was not needed to make the new bonds. In an endothermic reaction, over here on the right, inside this blue solution then, our chemical reaction needs more energy than what is present in order to form those bonds of the products. So it's going to pull heat in from the environment. Often we don't need a whole lot of heat to have one of these chemical reactions happen. It can just be a little bit of heat from the temperature of the room. The familiar baking soda and vinegar solution reaction that we've done many, many times as children and a couple times in lab is actually an endothermic reaction, but the heat of the room is usually enough energy source to have that reaction get the energy it needs to make the new bonds in the products. Now, as I said, we can calculate the enthalpy change, or the delta H, using what is known as bond energies. And bond energies are calculations that have come from experimental data. And we know that it's going to take energy to break the bonds, and it's going to take energy to make the bonds. And the formula we need is to take the number for breaking the bonds and subtract from that the energy that's needed to make the bonds, and that's going to give us our delta H. And I kind of lost my delta H. I didn't notice that it shifted. It just went onto the next line, so it really should be at the end there like an equation. So we have a little example here where you've got hydrogen plus chlorine gas. Put those together and gives you hydrogen chloride gas. So we have to break a bond between the hydrogens. We have to break a bond between the chlorine. And then we have to form new bonds between the hydrogen and the chlorine, and we have to do 2 of those because we're making 2 molecules. And we can calculate whether this is going to be an exothermic reaction that will give off heat or an endothermic reaction from this experimental data, because we have values, we have numbers for the amount of energy found in these various bonds based on experiments that many scientists have done in the past. So this is how we would apply it. We take those bond energy numbers. You can see that the bond between 2 hydrogen has been calculated to be 432 kilojoules per mole. So joules are the way that we measure energy. So we have a kilojoule would be 1,000 joules. So in a mole of hydrogen gas, of H2 compound, you will have that the energy in that bond will represent 432 kilojoules. Now, of course, individual bonds will have a tiny, tiny amount because atoms are so small, but when you add up a whole mole of atoms, you're going to get a considerable amount of energy. Then between our chlorine, we have a little bit less there. It only takes 240 kilojoules to hold those 2 atoms together. And then hydrogen and chlorine together take 428 kilojoules. So if we go through the whole process, our change in enthalpy will equal the energy it takes to break the bonds apart, and we always assume that all the bonds will break when we do these calculations. And we subtract from that the energy it's going to take to make the bonds in our new products. So if we take our bond energies and plug them into this formula over here, I have some numbers for you. So to break our hydrogen bond, it will be 432, plus the amount it's going to take to break that chlorine bond, so that'll be 240. So we're going to have to add those 2 together, and then subtract from it the amount of energy it's going to take to put together those 2 hydrogen chloride molecules. Each one will be 428, and we have 2 of them, so we have to multiply it by 2. And then if we go ahead and do all of the math, our end result is a negative 184 kilojoules per mole if we keep our units. And a negative 184 tells you that there is energy left over, so it is an exothermic reaction. It will be giving off heat into the environment. If you put a thermometer in it, the temperature would go up. If you touch the beaker, it would feel warm. So this is the way we can calculate whether a reaction is going to need to have energy added to it or if energy will come out. And as we go on to talk about why chemical reactions happen, this whole thing about energy and exothermic and endothermic reactions will become more important. This is just an introduction to get you started in thinking about it and realizing that the energy that is holding those atoms together then can be released and used to do different things.